Hello everyone. I'm sure that you have all heard the quip that goes round the gardening world each spring, that growing your own tomatoes is the best way to devote 3 months of your life to saving $2. Now, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but the reality is that we as gardeners do devote 3, 6, sometimes 12 months of our lives to this labor of love that is gardening. And if we're going to spend that much time doing anything, we want to be sure that it is worth our while. Now, in today's video, I'm going to share some tips for how to improve the flavor and yield of whatever you decide to grow in your garden this year, so that we can be sure that all of this time that we put into the garden is going to be worth it in the end come harvest time. So let's jump in. I'm going to share 3 tips which can be implemented this gardening season, and at the end of the video, I'll share 2 bonus tips which are a bit more of a long-term, big picture kind of a solution. Tip number 1 is focus on harvest time. For many fruits and vegetables, harvest timing is the difference between eating the most amazing tomato or watermelon you've ever had in your life and something that's just ho-hum. While I'm guessing most all of you know how to pick the perfect tomato, I'd like to share a few of the perhaps lesser known harvest tips. Let's start with carrots. Now, if you have never had a homegrown carrot pulled fresh out of the earth in December or even January, cleaned off and eaten right there on the spot, you have not lived. Okay, that might be a smidge of an exaggeration, but winter harvested carrots are unbelievably delicious. Now, this idea of a winter harvest departed quite a bit from the traditional timing that I was taught for planting carrots, which is that you plant early spring and harvest mid-summer. And while I still always do a spring planting, I'm sure to also do a late summer into fall planting for winter harvest as well. Like many vegetables, once the cold weather sets in and the frost sets in, the roots start to convert carbohydrates into sugar, and that's where you get that amazing flavor. Now, carrots, because they are a root vegetable, can be a bit tricky to tell when to harvest. I will typically always look at the shoulders first. So this portion that's going to be kind of just at ground level, and if I need to, I will scrape a little bit of the soil away to see how big those shoulders have gotten. So that's my first indicator. I'm typically looking for about 3/4 to an inch across, depending on the carrot variety. And then I'll typically do a test pull, where I pull up 1 or 2 of my carrots just to see how they've sized up before I get ready to harvest the whole batch. This gives me a good idea whether or not they've been in the ground long enough to develop a mature root. Now, this particular batch of carrots I planted on August 6th, and here we are now on February 16th, and these are holding so well in the garden, and they are incredibly delicious. Cold isn't just good for carrots. When we look at things like kale, collards, mustard, and Brussels sprouts, these members of the Brassica family have a somewhat bitter reputation. But it's not their fault. When these plants are harvested in the summer, they often do have a very unpleasant, bitter taste. And many of you have probably heard that it's better to wait until after at least 1 frost to harvest a lot of vegetables like this. And that is true. The reason, much like the carrots, is that once those cold temperatures set in, the starches in the plant start to develop into sugars, acting almost as a natural antifreeze for the plants. Good for the plants, also good for the humans who want to eat them because their flavor improves drastically. Watermelon is another garden staple that can be a bit tricky to tell when it's ready to harvest. With my watermelon, I typically skip the thumping and use the tendril trick instead. When the tendril closest to the stem dries down and turns brown, your watermelon is going to be ready to harvest. Now, keep in mind, this only works with healthy plants, so sometimes watermelon can get disease that affects the foliage and the tendrils, turning them prematurely dry and brown. So in this case, it won't work. But if your vines are healthy and your plants look good, the tendril trick works for me every time. Now, another easy harvest trick I have is with pumpkins and winter squash. Again, it can be kind of hard to tell when these are mature. Some will show an obvious color change, but I like the thumbnail trick. To do this, all you have to do is push a thumbnail into the rind. If it leaves an indentation, Your pumpkins or squash probably aren't ready for picking yet. If it doesn't leave an indentation, you're good to go. Now, tied in with this is the fact that some vegetables are actually better after a curing and storing process. This includes things like winter squash and pumpkins, as well as veggies like sweet potatoes and garlic. In fact, some winter squash don't even hit their peak sugars and flavor until months in storage. Now, the timing and the curing process will vary a bit from veggie to veggie, but the general idea with curing is that you put your vegetables in a safe, warm, dry environment and allow them to cure. So, and a lot of times that's curing over any little scrapes on the rind. It can be drying down in the case of the skins that cover garlic. And once that curing process is over, you can move them to long-term storage. Now with winter squash, this will vary between different types of squash. So delicata types, for example, don't require a curing process and are pretty much at peak flavor right after harvest. But for other types, again, will actually improve after that curing process and several months sitting in storage. Now next is a focus on sunlight and water to ensure that your vegetables and fruits have optimal flavor and yields. Getting the proper amount of sunlight and water is critical. Now, this may seem overly simplistic and obvious, but a few minor tweaks can make some major differences in your results. For most fruits and vegetables, especially fruiting vegetables, so think things like tomatoes, zucchini, watermelon, full sun is key to the development of the highest levels of sugars and aromatic compounds, which translates to us as the best flavor. Even for plants that will tolerate partial shade, growing in full sun most often results in a better flavor profile. Quite a few interesting studies have been done on this phenomenon. One study compared strawberries grown in shade to those grown in full sun. The sun-grown berries had double the amount of aroma compounds, which leads to a more intense or better flavor. A study on potatoes done in Germany showed that reducing the hours of sunlight from 10 hours to 7 hours a day resulted in a 20% drop in production. Now, there is one key exception to this. In pungent or bitter leafy greens, such as kale or arugula, higher light levels actually bump up the level of compounds that are responsible for those pungent or bitter flavors. So providing plants like that with some shade is likely going to result in a more mild and tender green. Now with water, everyone knows how important water is to plants. But did you know that too much water can actually wash out the flavor of many fruits and vegetables? If you've ever had a big rain, especially if that rain occurs after a substantially dry period, you have probably witnessed this effect. Fruit and fruiting vegetables are particularly susceptible to this. When you get a lot of rain after a dry period, they pull up all the moisture they can. Fruits and fruiting vegetables are particularly susceptible to this. When you get a lot of rain after a dry period, they will pull up a ton of moisture very, very quickly. When this happens, it can actually cause the exterior skin or rind to burst. This huge influx of water also acts to water down the intensity of flavor in your produce, diluting those sugars, compounds, and chemicals that comprise what we perceive as flavor. Now, while we can't control the rain, what we can control is the amount of water that our plants receive the rest of the season, ensuring that they're getting plenty of supplemental water while the plants are still young and getting established. It's also providing supplemental water during extremely dry periods. And while this may seem really obvious, it's more than just the health of the plant. Providing consistent moisture helps prevent that splitting and cracking and the dilution of flavor. It can also help prevent issues like blossom end rot. For fruit and fruiting vegetables, if you can actually cut off water a week or so before the harvest, this can lead to a pleasantly intensified flavor. For leafy greens, again, the opposite can be true. So if you want really tender, sweet, juicy leafy greens, providing plenty of water right up until harvest will help with that. But if you prefer your greens on the bitter or pungent side, reducing water can help boost up those compounds. And the third tip is to focus on variety selection. And this one is huge in my world. I am a self-professed variety snob. A large portion of my career has been devoted to trialing and testing and tasting new varieties, growing them out in a home garden setting and evaluating them for flavor and yields and disease resistance, as well as spending countless hours traipsing through breeding fields, listening to breeders, and looking at all the differences between varieties. I've seen over and over what a difference variety can make in the home garden. Now, the first big, broad consideration for selecting varieties comes down to the choice between hybrids and open-pollinated varieties. And within that open-pollinated category, we can also often break down between open-pollinated and heirloom open-pollinated, because while all heirlooms are open-pollinated, not necessarily all open-pollinated varieties are heirlooms. So to add to that mix, there is also no standardized definition of an heirloom, but the generally accepted terms are that we are looking at varieties that were bred before the 1950s. That is when hybridization really got hold and became popular. As I mentioned, they are also always open-pollinated and have been handed down through the generations, whether by families or groups of seed collectors or what have you. And heirlooms have long been lauded as the flavor favorites of the gardening world. Heirloom tomatoes in particular have been all the rage over the last about decade and a half. And I'm sure that you have heard a neighbor or a friend swear by something like purple Cherokee or pink Brandywine being the best tomato they've ever eaten, or maybe you've had that experience yourself. And while it is true that if the weather and the pests and the diseases cooperate and Pluto aligns with the fifth star from Neptune, you may pick the biggest, most beautiful, most delicious tomato you've ever had in your life off of an heirloom plant. Chances are more likely that you will get one or two not very pretty, but pretty delicious tomatoes off of your heirloom plants, but they will probably be diseased and cracked or cat-faced and honestly not worth the effort. Now, I love heirloom and open-pollinated varieties. Do not get me wrong. There are so many amazing plants out there with such really neat stories, and seed saving is an incredibly important skill that everyone should at least practice. There's also the case to be made for selecting and saving your own seeds so that you can build up stock that is well suited to your own little microclimate. But that, my friends, is a video for another day. If you've struggled with heirloom or open-pollinated varieties before and really want to just, for once, grow a really nice plant, you might consider looking at a hybrid variety. Now, hybrids are created when breeders intentionally cross two varieties aiming to create an offspring or a hybrid that contains some of the best traits of both parents. And I have to make the point here, though most of you probably know, hybrids are not GMOs. Today's modern hybrids not only offer exceptional disease resistance and yields, but often have superior flavor as well. We kind of went through a phase in the horticultural world where hybrids were associated with a lot of negative traits. Plant breeders were focusing on increased production, disease resistance, and the ability to be shipped long distances at the expense of the actual eating quality. But that is changing. People refuse to eat tasteless tomatoes, and even more so, refuse to grow tasteless tomatoes in their gardens. And the breeders are following their lead. When I started in the industry, it wasn't uncommon for me to visit a breeding field trial, ask a breeder what a tomato tasted like, and they had no idea because they never even tasted it. That wasn't on their radar for traits to look at. That rarely happens anymore. Almost every trial I visit, the breeders are in touch with the flavor. They are looking at flavor compounds. They are sending their varieties out to the lab to have Brix levels tested. So it's definitely a changing scene in the breeding world. Now, although hybrids have come a long way in the last 20 or 30 years, like our open-pollinated heirloom varieties, they tend to be regionally adapted, meaning they're better suited for one specific growing area, whether that be the Midwest or the California coast or the Deep South, than any other growing area. You would think that when you walk into a garden center, the seeds and plants that they're offering there would be tailored to the growing area that they are catering to. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. Some of the smaller nurseries do a better job with this, but often those varieties are just the best sellers for a national company, and they're not looking at specific growing areas. So a great example of this, once again, is tomatoes. The largest commercial tomato growing areas in the United States are California and Florida. So the big commercial breeders are looking at work that is best suited to those growing conditions. Particularly, the varieties that they're selecting are showing great disease resistance and pest resistance and performance in those growing areas. Unfortunately, you come back to the Midwest where I'm located, and we don't even have any of those pests or diseases. And the ones that we do have, these tomatoes are not showing any resistance to at all. I've seen tomatoes that yield big, beautiful fruit and have these gorgeous, huge, healthy plants in California. I bring them back to my Ohio garden and they look terrible. So that's even with a nice, new, vigorous hybrid variety. It just does not work in most cases. The good news is there are a couple of relatively easy ways to find varieties which are going to be well suited to your specific growing area. The first is to check out the All-American Selections regional winners, because they've done a lot of the work for you already. All-American Selections is a group which looks at new varieties every single year, has test gardens all over the United States with judges who evaluate these varieties for flavor, yield, performance, disease resistance, and at the end of the year, everything is judged and awarded either a national AAS award or they have regional AAS awards for varieties that showed superior performance in specific regions. So for me, being in Ohio, I can just go and check out the Great Lakes region winners. Often the varieties that win for the Northeast and the Southeast will work here as well. You can also seek out seed companies that specialize in regional varieties. One of my recent favorites is a company called Fruition Seeds, and they're located in Naples, New York. They specialize in varieties that are well adapted to thrive in their short seasons, and many share extraordinary cold hardiness as well as disease resistance. They're also working with the Cornell breeding program on a lot of varieties, and I've had great luck with everything that I've grown from them so far. For open pollinated and heirloom varieties, friends of mine love the Sandhill Preservation Center out of Iowa. And this is a small, home-based, privately funded germplasm center focused on preserving heirloom seed varieties. I also always find it interesting to peruse something like Seed Savers Exchange for varieties which originated in Ohio or surrounding areas. The big advantage to this is by seeking out varieties that have adapted to my specific growing conditions, the chances are they're going to do much better in my garden. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that just because a seed company is located in a certain area, we can't just assume that the seeds are being produced in that area as well. More often than not, this is not the case. Most seed companies, especially bigger ones, have seed production happening all over the United States. So unless a company is telling you specifically these seeds are produced in Ohio or Indiana, it's not something we can just assume. Now, SeedLinked is another amazing resource for finding varieties which may be well suited to your growing region. They've built out a database based on years of information from citizen scientist trials so that you can search for varieties by a number of criteria, including varieties that have ranked well with growers in the same zone or state as you. So for example, if I want to find a tomato that will do well in my growing area, I can go to the SeedLinked seed search, select the specific crop I want to look at, in this case, tomatoes. I can then select where I want to see ratings from. I can drill down to country, state, and hardiness zone if I want. I can also filter for specific traits. So let's look for a beefsteak with great flavor and disease resistance. I can then check out the specifics on each variety. So here we've got West Virginia 63, and I can see all the reviews or just those from my same growing area. I can see here that 77% of folks would grow it again, as well as how it ranked for yield, flavor, appearance, disease resistance, and earliness, as well as what the growers are saying specifically about this variety. So this is a resource I cannot recommend enough. I think it is really cool what they are doing, and I feel like it's a bit underutilized by gardeners, so definitely check that one out. And always talk to your friends and neighbors, which I'm sure many of you are doing already. In my experience, folks are always more than happy to share the varieties that have done well for them. So if neighbor Bill down the street has grown pink brandywine for 20 years and it does amazing for him every year, chances are it might work for you too. Better yet, if you can get some of his saved seed. And one final resource, you can always contact your local extension agency as well. Now, recommendation results here are going to vary quite a bit from extension agency to extension agency. Some of them are really good. They're really on top of varieties and can give you some really good recommendations. Unfortunately, some of the recommendations tend to be pretty outdated and generic. So just try it out, but take that with a grain of salt. And now onto those longer term bonus tips. So these are 2 things that you can focus on that are really going to pay off dividends in the long run. And that is to focus on soil health and fertility. Optimizing the health of the soil microbiome and ensuring that plants are receiving the proper nutrients are 2 of the very best ways to improve the yield and flavor of everything you grow. Now, for the broad overview, most vegetables and fruits are going to do well in loose, loamy soil that's rich in organic matter, but there's definitely a range there. Carrots tend to like sandier soil. Okra will tolerate clay. Blueberries prefer high acidity. So it's important to know what you're working with. Now, many of you are long-term gardeners and I'm sure are well acquainted with your soil, but if you're new to gardening or just want to try a fun little at-home experiment, there is a super simple soil experiment you can do to determine your basic soil makeup to see how much clay, how much sand, and how much silt your soil makeup is comprised of. So basically, you're just going to put some soil in a jar, add some water, shake it up, and let it settle into layers. If you want to see more detail on how to do that specifically, check out this video, but it is a fun at-home experiment. Now, if you already know your soil type, for instance, here in my Ohio garden, I'm predominantly clay, so my soil is very heavy. I do recommend that everyone get a soil test done at least once, so a soil test done by a lab. This allows you to check things like your organic matter levels, your pH, the varying levels of macro and micronutrients that exist in your soil. It's just a really helpful tool, especially for pinpointing any areas that may be problematic. This is something I recommend, especially if you've been gardening and are having trouble and just can't seem to pinpoint what is going on. Oftentimes things come back to soil issues. So if you get that lab test done and it helps you identify certain deficiencies or overages in nutrients, you can correct those and balance those through amendments. Now, in addition to addressing some of those specific issues with a soil lab test, I also have some general practices which have worked really well for me in improving the health of my soil. I focus heavily on the addition of organic matter each spring and fall, and for that I use things like green manures or cover crops, leaf mold, composted wood chips and bark, well-aged manure, compost, biochar, and worm castings. To improve soil health, I also try to raise up all of my planting areas and avoid any kind of excess compaction, so I'm not walking in any of my garden beds. I also try to reduce the amount of disruption that's occurring with the soil. So I'm not entirely no-till, but I do try to minimize disruption as much as possible. This allows for a robust soil microbiome to develop. I also always focus on keeping my soil surface covered, whether that is with a green cover crop or with a natural mulch of some type. Now, soil fertility and nutrition for your plants kind of all goes hand in hand with that soil health, but there are some specific things I wanted to mention here. Now, I'm sure it's obvious to most of you that we need to feed our plants. And if you have beautiful, loamy, rich in organic matter soil, you may be able to get away with not providing any supplemental nutrition for your plants. Your soil health is great, and that is what we are all aiming for. Unfortunately, with my Ohio clay through the years, I've had to kind of add some little boosts to really get the most optimal flavor and yields out of the plants that I'm growing here. Now I have a whole video which kind of goes into my fertilization techniques in the garden, but in general, I opt for natural sources of nutrition for my plants. So whether that's naturally derived fertilizers or things like composted animal manure, just anything that's going to help feed the soil microbiome, which in turn helps more efficiently feed my plants. Other natural components that can help feed plants and improve the soil include things like blood meal, bone meal, worm castings, molasses, fish emulsion, rock dust, and humic acids. There are not only a ton of fertilizers derived from these ingredients on the market, but it's also pretty easy to make your own if you like. Again, I think ultimate goal, we want to build a soil ecosystem which is robust enough to give the plants everything they need without any inputs. But this is definitely something that, especially in the early years, can help give everything a boost. Plants just will not yield to their potential, and they will not have the best flavor if they're not getting the proper inputs. So that covers the ways I have found to ensure that my flavor and yields in the garden are great each year. And I'd love to hear from you. If you have any tips that you can share for how to improve flavor and yields, drop a line in the comments below and let me know. And if you found today's video helpful, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.